Welcome to Module 4. This week, we'll be discussing the art and architecture of ancient Egypt. And this lecture will serve as an introduction to some of the concepts that we need to consider when looking at Egyptian art, and also an overview of the history. At the same time that city-states were forming in Mesopotamia, places like Sumer, Babylon, the Assyrian kingdom, and Persia way down over here, Egypt starts rising along the Nile. And here is that region here. We'll be looking at the Nile. People start settling in the Nile River Valley around 8000 BCE. They live on fish, game, and wild plants. Around 5500 BCE, the first agricultural Neolithic villages emerge. And note that agriculture happens here a lot later than it does in Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, agriculture happens in 9000 BCE. In Egypt, they didn't really need it. They had plenty of natural resources thanks to the Nile. The Nile didn't just provide resources, it really dominated Egyptian life, society, history, and culture for thousands of years. Why is this? It was really a creative force. It supplied reliable, fertile soil, and it was extremely predictable. The floodplains, the flood patterns of the Nile were very reliable and predictable, unlike the Tigris and the Euphrates, whose floods really created a lot of chaos. Every September, the valley would flood and leave behind a muddy, rich soil. In November, the floodplains would retreat, and this would produce as I said, a muddy, boggy soil that was very rich and hospitable for agriculture. This meant that there was an annual surplus of crops, which was conducive to having a prosperous, large population that could be fed by the reliability that the Nile produced. It also is a highway that unites Upper and Lower Egypt. And you'll notice that Lower Egypt is up here in the north. This is a little confusing. It's up here in the north, and below it down in the south is Upper Egypt. So it's kind of flip-flopped, remember that. All of the major cultural centers that we'll be looking at are located right on the Nile, starting with Giza, where the pyramids are up here. It also was a great way to transport goods throughout the region. And because of this, they didn't need to go outside of the region for materials and resources. They had stone for architecture, they had clay for pottery, they had gold for ornamentation, they could easily get copper from Sinai, and timber from Lebanon in the northeast. Although they didn't really need timber that much, but when they needed it, they could easily get it. Like Mesopotamia, Egypt was a very advanced and sophisticated culture. There were a lot of firsts that happened in Egypt. They invented the column, which was extremely influential for the Greeks, the latrine. They invented a form of writing called hieroglyphics, and once they invented it, they used it a lot. And we have lots of writing that tells us a lot about, especially the elite society in Egypt. So we have a lot of documentation. One of the most important things to note with ancient Egyptian art and architecture is the concept of longevity and stability. The art really reflects that this is a culture that went on for thousands of years and did not change dramatically within that time. It lasted for more than 3,000 years and showed an incredible amount of continuity. And if you think about how the age of the United States is 15 times less than that, and if you consider how often our culture shifts. For example, less than 20 years ago, there was no Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, and so many of the things that we take for granted have only been around for a decade or so. Egyptians could really count on the fact that their lives did not differ very much from their ancestors of thousands of years ago. Egypt's stability is in stark contrast to the ancient Near East of the same period, which endured an overlapping series of cultures and upheavals with amazing regularity. We talked about several different cultures that supplanted a preceding culture in Mesopotamia. Egypt was extremely stable throughout millennia. And when you look at the art, to the untrained eye, Egyptian art doesn't seem to change much for thousands of years. And just to demonstrate this, I'm showing you two details. One is from the Palette of Narmer, which is one of the oldest objects we're going to look at that was made in about 3000 BCE. And then you can compare that to an object, a relief from more than 1,000 years later. And we see much of the same conventions, much of the same iconography. This was intentional. A vast amount of the Egyptian imagery, especially royal imagery, that was governed by a decorum, a sense of what was appropriate. And this remained kind of stupefyingly consistent throughout its history. And this is why, again, to the untrained eye, their art seems extremely static in terms of symbols, gestures, the way the body is rendered. It was very static. It was intentional. The Egyptians were aware of their consistency, and they viewed it as stability, a divine balance, and clear evidence of the correctness of their culture. Another thing to remember is that this was a culture that was centered entirely around the afterlife. And this consistency was closely related to a fundamental belief that depictions had an impact beyond the image itself. Tomb scenes of the deceased receiving food, or temple scenes of kings performing perfect rituals for the gods, these were functionally causing these things to occur in a divine realm. So if an image of a loaf of bread was emitted from the deceased's table, for example, they had no bread in the afterlife. If the king was depicted with the incorrect ritual implement, the ritual was incorrect forever, and this could have dire consequences. This belief led to an active resistance to change, and we have these codified depictions over and over and over again. It also means, and this is something that is sometimes forgotten, is that all of the art that we'll be looking at was not meant for the eyes of the living. Almost all of the art that we're looking at is funerary art that was meant to be buried in a tomb and only be seen by the dead. The study of Egyptian archaeology is a particular branch called Egyptology, and it's really a modern discipline. It started in the 18th century when archaeological explorations of the Nile began. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte took a small troop of scholars, linguists, and artists with him on a military expedition. And they found, by accident, a artifact that has come to be known as the Rosetta Stone, which is now housed in the British Museum. And this became the key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. It showed the same text, or what they assumed was the same text, in 3 different languages. Greek, which the scholars knew and could translate, one in Demotic, which is a late Egyptian script, and one in formal hieroglyphics. And they figured out that the hieroglyphs were not simple pictographs, but rather the written form of a once spoken language. Much of Egyptian history and culture was actually forgotten throughout the Middle Ages. And in the reinterest of ancient texts, archaeologists started to go back to ancient historians to find out more about Egypt. Much of what we know then comes from 2 sources, and they are not very reliable sources. Manetho, who was a 3rd century BCE Egyptian priest, and Herodotus, a 5th century Greek traveler and scholar. Manetho was very much involved in the propaganda of dynasties, and so his dating is not very reliable. There's often fudging of the dates, and it's not, again, we need to have secondary texts that back up his documentation. Herodotus, being Greek, had different names for many of the pharaohs. So this is also a problematic text. But starting with the study of these texts, we were able to get a sketched out timeline of Egyptian history. And Egyptology mainly concentrates on periods that have been sketched out by these texts. The first is the pre-dynastic moment, which is Neolithic. And this predates the union of Lower and Upper Egypt. It spans from about 1500 BCE to 3150 BCE. Then we have the early dynastic period from 3150 to 2626 BCE. Then we have 3 major kingdoms that are long-lived and punctuated by intermediate periods of relative chaos. So we have the Old Kingdom that begins in 2686 and goes until 2181 BCE, followed by one of these intermediate chaotic periods from 2125 to 1975 BCE. And then we have the Middle Kingdom from 2040 to 1782 BCE, followed by another intermediate period between 1782 and 1570 BCE. And finally, the New Kingdom from 1570 to 1070 BCE.